Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd be interested in knowing if any of your states have raised the state gas tax and what the effect, what public opinion, what the effect on public opinion was, and what do you think would be the effect of raising the federal gas tax now that perhaps some state gas taxes have been raised? If you had both gas taxes, I'd be interested in what all of you have to say about that.
Yes, ma'am, Ranking Member. Texas has not raised their gas tax since 1992, so it's much the same case. But when you watch gas prices every day swing 10, 15 cents a gallon, I'm not sure how much a penny and a half, 2 pennies would be noticed. Certainly there's been conversations in Austin about gas tax, about vehicle miles traveled. There's been a lot of suggestions being made. We recognize as a state that something needs to be done, but much like what's happening across the country, a lot of conversation, we just haven't made that decision yet.
Mr. Patterson and Mr. Mayor Reed?
Oklahoma has not raised their gas tax, our gas tax, since 1987. Governor Fallin has proposed to increase our fuel tax. It's estimated that by June we will have the lowest fuel tax in the country at 14 cents for diesel.
So how's that working out for you?
It's not working out too well. So Governor Fallin has made that proposal to increase it to 24 cents for each diesel and gasoline, and it's going through the legislative process at this point.
Mayor Reed?
Yes, ma'am. Our governor, Nathan Deal, in 2015, a Republican governor with almost near constitutional majorities in our House and in our Senate in Georgia with Republican majorities in both, raised the gas tax and raised $1 billion as a result of that. In the city of Atlanta in November, we passed $2.6 billion for the largest expansion of our transit system in history. It passed with 71% local support. We also had a T-SPLOST funding measure that passed with 68% local support, funding more than $300 million in infrastructure. A year prior to that, we had a local referendum for a $250 million infrastructure bond. It passed with more than 80% support. So my state, I'm from the state of Georgia. We have a very conservative state, and all of these measures have been passed with broad majorities. Mm-hmm. The legislative majority was in the General Assembly for the $1 billion in road money. And then the other items that I referenced regarding MARTA, our transit system, and our infrastructure funds have been done within the city of Atlanta. So I think it's a nice mix of urban and rural, showing that whether you're focused on rural folks or urban folks, people get that we need significant infrastructure investment.
Very instructive. Conservative or Republican, nobody's found a way to build roads and bridges and transit systems without money. And I'm interested in what the states have done, because almost half the states have taken the initiative, seeing that the federal government is stuck and has been stuck for a generation. One more question. I'd like to, I got into the FAST Act. Actually, it was the idea of a number of us funds for alternatives. We don't just criticize the fact that Congress won't, or your states, for those two states for that matter, continue to ignore the need for funds. We look for alternative funds, and note that some states have found alternative ways or suggested alternatives, actually experimenting. And there's $10 billion in the FAST Act for such experimentation. Looking at the notions to come forward recently about private investment as a way to fund roads, and the investors getting back their investment through, I suppose, fares or tolls or the rest. I'd be interested in knowing whether you think relying more heavily on private investment would help us, in fact, hasten the work that needs to be done on our roads, bridges, and infrastructure.
In Oklahoma, and in many states, we have seen a reliance more on private investor. In Oklahoma, we have our Turnpike Authority, which was created back in the late 40s to develop a high-speed, safe transportation facility between Oklahoma City and Tulsa. From that point, it has expanded on, and it's clearly a tolling authority, but the private investors are the moms and pops around the country that buy bonds. So we can't forget that that is a private investing opportunity. It's
Could
not
you
the
could you
typical PPP.
could you build most of your roads using tolls? Would the public tolerate that?
No, ma'am, we can't, and we realize that. We understand that at this point, many states are relying on some sort of tolling to make up the difference between adequate funding at both the state and federal level.
Could I just get answers from the other two witnesses, please?
Congresswoman, I think that it depends, that as long as you keep your focus on project models versus tax credit models. So I think that the conversation has to be around real projects. Probably the most successful public-private partnership we have in our city is a project called the Atlanta Beltline, where we reclaimed 22 miles of old abandoned railroads, and now the $400 million in public support has triggered $3.8 billion in private capital attracted to renovating that entire corridor and creating about 1,200 acres of green space. That is a project model where everybody knows where the focus is going to be, and everybody is tracking the jobs that are being created. The concern that we're experiencing is moving to a tax credit model for the financial services community or financiers. And so that's the distinction that I think is going to be really important as we have this conversation. The most striking and most successful public-private partnerships that I have seen have been project-specific with very broad community buy-in.
Mr. Thomas?
Yes, ma'am. From a transit industry perspective, it's a little bit different. Transit P3s are a great opportunity, perhaps, as long as you understand going into it that that money is going to cost you more than what you could typically borrow other places. So there are levels of public-private partnerships. Certainly, in one case where we work very closely with Uber and Lyft, that's a public-private partnership of sorts. On the other hand, when we do a design-build project, that's a public-private partnership, perhaps at the lowest level, but no funding or financing involved. When you get to the funding financing level, and of course the associated risk-sharing opportunities, those cost more money. The private sector is going to expect higher interest rate on the money that they put into a project than what we can typically get through the federal funds or even a RIF or TIFIA loan.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Davis, 5 minutes.